much. Before I start, and to be honest, I must tell you, I must confess, I must warn you, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher either. I'll speak today as a novelist, as a French novelist, as you can probably tell from my accent. I will speak starting with one novel. I will speak as the author of this novel, Le Chat de Schrödinger. Okay. It's a novel that has been published in France 10 years ago and that since has been translated into several languages, including Chinese. And I suppose this is the reason of the invitation I received for this Congress. And I'm very pleased and honored, of course, to speak in front of you. The title of my paper, as Claire said, is The Quantum Novel, Science and Literature. I don't know whether the phrase quantum novel exists or not in English. If it doesn't, I will invent it for the purpose of this paper. But of course, to speak of a quantum novel, as I will be doing, doesn't make much sense, of course, because quantum physics refers, as far as I know, refers to a certain number of theories born in the 20th century, theories which account for the atomic or subatomic world, the one in which the particles evolve. These theories, of course, are not intended to apply to literature. And in the same way, literature is foreign to the field in which these theories develop, theories which are based on observation, experimentation, mathematical formalization, as you know, according to the methods proper to scientific research. Literature and science are certainly two discourses that reflect reality. But between a poem, for instance, and an equation, there is as much distance, as much difference, as a French expression goes, as between a fish and an apple. And I have a little bit the feeling today that I am like a fish among apples or like an apple among fish. There is, however, an abundant literature devoted to quantum physics. But the word literature here must be put between quotation marks. I'm referring to the works of scientists, starting with Schrödinger and Heisenberg, to the works of philosophers, who have devoted fascinating works, of course, to quantum theories. Some of these works are very complex and difficult to read, while others appear, even to the uninitiated, to be extrapolation in which the hypotheses of fundamental physics serve as a dubious endorsement for a somewhat strange discourse on the universe and its secret. It is this discourse that has been used by popular culture, especially on the side of science fiction, by validating old reveries concerning, for instance, the journey in time or the existence of parallel realities. But as far as literature itself is concerned, it seemed to me that it has rarely found its inspiration in quantum physics. I could be wrong, of course, and I could ignore the existence of important works, but to my knowledge, there is no such thing as quantum literature, if such an expression means anything. In any case, when I wrote my novel 10 years ago, Le Chat de Schrödinger, although I read a large number of philosophical and scientific works for the occasion, I had no literary model to rely on or to refer to. This is why when the book came out 10 years ago, there were a number of critics who credited me, generously and probably wrongly, with having invented the quantum novel. Of course, I will be dealing with that gap between the two cultures which has been mentioned in the previous paper, but using a different image which might be suitable for the conference we are gathered for. So, a gap between science and literature. Of course, there are literary works in which one finds a genuine interest in science. Especially, to take one example, there is a book I'd like to mention, a book which comes to my mind and which may have inspired me when I wrote Le Chat Schrödinger. This example is the example of a contemporary novel constructed by importing a scientific model into the field of literature. It is an Italian novel. It's the book of Primo Levi's masterpiece, the Periodic System, which was published in 1975, and in which the Italian writer, who was a chemist himself, uses Mendeleev's table of elements to draw from it the very structure of his autobiographical narrative. There is this example, but it is an exception. The rule that prevails, the rule that separates science from literature and literature from science, that rule is the rule which prevails in such a field is that of ignorance or of indifference. In an essay published in France in 1980, the French philosopher Michel Serres compared the space that in our culture separates science and literature to the Northwest Passage, the one through which the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean communicate through the archipelago of Canada's far north. If I can go back, I'll show you the image again. Here it is. Image which, as I said, seems appropriate today, since it shows that a path is to be found between two separate continents, science and literature, but maybe a path is to be found as well that will lead us from the east to the west and from the east to the west. This passage, this way that we have to find, Michel Serres describes it this way. It is, writes Michel Serres, a difficult, cluttered path, a real labyrinth of earth, water, and ice, a path that is not given once and for all, but that must be built, discovered each time. But still, the gap exists. The separation exists. And I think that the fault lies rather with the writers rather than with the scientists. However, there have been writers in the past who have drawn their inspiration from science. I can quote a few examples, a few famous examples. Lucretius, the Latin poet, the author of De Natura Rerum, or Dante, the Italian poet, the writer of the Divine Comedy, or at the beginning of the 19th century, the German novelist and poet Goethe with affinitive electives. But things have changed a lot since then. We saw this morning several times on screen, we saw the face of German philosopher Heidegger, the author of Sein und Zeit, probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, or at least the most influential of them. Heidegger said, science doesn't think, science as opposed to philosophy. And it's not very difficult to find writers in Europe today, novelist, poet, that with great assurance depreciate science in favor of art by claiming that only the latter puts us in touch with the truth. And of course, such a position, if it is very common, is quite obscurantist. I think that, to make my point, I think that the novel, if the gap is to be crossed, if the separation between science and literature is to be abolished, the novel must absolutely not have as a purpose, must absolutely not aim to illustrate a truth that science has established and to which literature should submit by contenting itself with proposing a poetic translation of that scientific truth. Such a formula, which has often been used in the past, has always had very catastrophic effects. Each discourse, science or poetry, must develop itself according to its own rules and according to its own aims. And these rules, these aims, cannot be transposed as such from one field to another. Each discourse, therefore, makes use of the other discourse, but in a manner that should be rather described as metaphorical. Science borrows images from poetry and puts them to the test of its own discipline to measure their eventual value. Who doesn't see, for example, that the Big Bang theories, whatever the verifiable data on which astrophysics is based, come straight from the old cosmogonic fantasies of myth. On the other side, poetry and the novel can borrow some of their hypotheses from the sciences in order to draw from sciences the materials of their fables, of their stories. This is what I tried to do in Schrödinger's cat 10 years ago by relying on the famous thought experiment proposed by Evelyn Schrödinger. I just remind you of that experiment, although it's well known. Schrödinger, in order to demonstrate the inanity of such an extrapolation, imagines that if we accept the idea that a particle can be in so-called superimposed and contradictory states, we must also admit that a cat can be both dead and alive at the same time, which he does not believe, and that I don't believe either. But Schrödinger invents a kind of fable in order to warn us against the use that some would like to make of his theory by extending to the world that is ours rules that are only valid in the universe specific to quantum physics. In my turn, after many others, I make mine his fable, I appropriate this fable in order to make it say something else, that all reality is double, duplicated, escapes us, that the world of day and that the world of night, the world of dream and the world of reality, the world of life and the world of death are perhaps mysteriously intertwined in such a way that it is possible to pass perpetually from one to the other. As a quotation at the very beginning of my novel, as an epigraph to my novel, I quoted this sentence from Spanish painter Pablo Picasso. Picasso said, "When I read a book on Einstein's physics that I don't understand anything about it, it doesn't matter. It will make me understand something else." Art and literature, I believe, have every interest in borrowing from science some of its hypotheses, even if they are unintelligible when transposed into his own domain. They allow the painter, the poet, by analogy, to better understand the mystery of the world with which he is confronted, or to better understand to what extent and in what way this mystery is and remains forever incomprehensible. As such, even a false and unfounded theory, some philosophers have said it, even a false and unfounded theory can possess an operative virtue, a real efficiency. I defended this idea in one of my books, and I think that we have to be aware of the truth that lies sometimes in theories that prove to be false or wrong. Because a truth can be born from an error. It is by losing one's way that one sometimes manages to find one's way. A false theory, and one that is known to be false, frees, liberates the resources of the imagination and allows the mind to access a reality that it would not otherwise have imagined. In this respect, the most dubious fantasies born out of credulity and superstition, even when we do not believe in them, can possess the same operative virtues as experimentally verified scientific theories. With quantum physics, a further step has been taken that gives scientific discourse a design character in connivance with the consciousness we have of the world. From what I understand, that is to say, according to the metaphorical use I make of it, science with quantum physics is taking note of the very problematic status of the knowledge it produces, and which can no longer be reduced to the current ideas we have of truth, according to the old reasonable schemes inherited from Aristotle's logic. We learn at high school that light must be considered at the same time as if it were made of waves and particles. Life itself must be considered at the same time as if it were made of truth and of fiction. That's what quantum physics helps us to understand. After the principle of uncertainty, as established by Heisenberg, due to the theory of superimposed states which can be deduced from Schrödinger's equation, due to the thesis developed by Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen School, the subatomic universe studied by quantum physics appears to be refractory to any form of mental representation, incapable of being reduced to any image in accordance with the current experience we have of the universe around us. From this point on, all sorts of questions arise about the very status of reality, about our ability to know reality, about our claim to develop discourses about reality, discourses that would tell us what reality means, if it means anything. But the very notions of position, speed, and state, as you know, with quantum theory, lose their usual meaning and their ability to be simply associated with each other. So much so that, stripped of all its traditional attributes, the object, if it can be called an object, the object on which quantum physics is concerned appears as unthinkable as the famous Lichtenberg's knife without a handle and whose blade is missing. At the end of the day, and this is my conclusion, the scientist and the novelist find themselves before the world as if they were standing before an enigma whose last word escapes them. Unable to say what it is with the words of ordinary language, they discover, the scientist and the novelist, they discover that for this very reason, they are forced to rely on the formalization of another language, that of their equations for the scientist, that of their fictions for the novelist. Warned of the way in which the universe escapes the attempt at symbolization in which they are engaged, they nevertheless do not give up interpreting the world and transforming it. The scientist and the novelist, nevertheless, watch the same emptiness of a reality that resists the representation they elaborate of it. With the help of the always inappropriate images they invent in order to express the meaning of reality, or maybe its nonsense. The cat that I have made the hero of my novel makes manifest to us, to the reader, what is happening with the vertigo of reality to which we generally prefer to close our eyes. This cat, in my novel, is like a messenger between parallel and superimposed universes whose unthinkable sum contains, as Joyce puts it in his Ulysses, I quote, the infinite possibility of possibilities. In this respect, this cat, the hero of my novel, draws its existence from contemporary science, of which I give an account in my book. But this cat owes as much, and perhaps more, to other reveries that bring each of us back to the infancy of our thought, when the mind, our mind, the mind of the child, quite astonished, awakens to the incomprehensible and tries to give it a form, which, first of all, is that given to the children by tales and legends. The box in which Schrödinger locks his cat and which hides it from view, making it impossible to say whether it is dead or alive, is quite similar to that other box in which, for lack of knowing how to draw it, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry places the ship that the little prince asks him to draw. As for the cat itself, it has features that are quite similar to those that Lewis Carroll attributes to his cat, which, before, as you know, Alice's eyes, keeps appearing and disappearing in Wonderland, the cat of which only the smile remains, floating in the air. A slightly, and there will be my last word, a slightly ironic smile, the smile of the cat, a slightly ironic smile that says everything and says nothing, and which, as such, is the same as that which is often seen on the lip of scientists and poets, because this smile constitutes the last possible word of all thought. Thank you.